Hey everyone, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be diving deep into something a lot of you are thinking about
Yeah.
as you transition from military service back to civilian life. And that is
Back to the real world.
exactly back to the real world. Your employment rights.
Yeah.
What do you have? What are you entitled to?
Exactly.
And we've got like the ultimate source for this.
Oh, yeah.
We're looking at a joint publication
Straight from the top.
from the Department of Labor, the
Oh,
Department
yeah.
of Justice, and the EEOC.
All the big players. So we know this is the real deal. This is the good stuff.
Yeah, this is it. This is like, if you want to know what your rights are as a veteran or service member transitioning back to civilian life, this is the document to look at. Okay, so first things first.
Yeah.
USERRA. Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act.
The big one.
This one is huge GE.
Absolutely.
So break it down for me. What is USERRA all about?
So USERRA is all about making sure that when you leave your civilian job to go serve your country, you don't get penalized for it.
Right.
And when you come back, you're not starting from scratch. It's about protecting you from discrimination just because you wore the uniform. And
Right.
it's about that reemployment piece.
And that reemployment piece, it's
Sure.
not just anybody job. You're entitled to get back the same job with the same seniority as if you had never left.
Exactly.
Like you were promoted along with everybody else while you were gone. Like they have to basically pretend
Right.
that you were there the whole time.
So, like, let's say you left as a, I don't know, as a manager at a, retail store. And you go off and you serve for a few years. While you're gone, everyone else is getting promoted. They're moving up the ranks.
Right.
Yazera says that when you come back, you step back into that position, or an equivalent one, with the seniority, the status, and the pay that you would have earned if you had never left.
Okay. Now, I know a lot of people are listening and
Yeah.
thinking, okay, great, but do I even qualify for you, Sarah? There's that 5-year rule.
Right. The 5-year cumulative service limit, it gets a lot of people. It basically means that you're generally covered if your service was less than 5 years total.
So less than 5 years total. Okay.
Right.
But there are exceptions to that rule.
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely exceptions, and it's super important to understand those. So if you're thinking, wait, I served for 6 years, am I automatically out of luck?
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Don't just assume you're not covered.
So give us some examples of those exceptions. When might that 5-year limit not apply?
So think about situations where your service was extended involuntarily. You signed up for 4 years, and then bam, you're deployed unexpectedly, and suddenly you're at 6 years.
Yeah.
That extra time, because it wasn't your choice, might not count against your 5-year limit.
Well, that's good to know.
Or think about folks with highly specialized skills, something the military really needs. Your employer might be required to hold your position for way longer than 5 years because you're filling such a crucial role.
So it's not just a simple number. It
Mm.
really depends on the individual situation.
Exactly. Context matters.
Okay, so if someone's listening and thinking, all right, this 5-year thing, I'm not sure if I fall under that. What should they do?
I would definitely recommend checking out the VTS website. The Department of Labor has this really cool tool called the USERRA Advisor. It walks you through all the eligibility criteria and helps you figure out where you stand.
Awesome. So USERRA Advisor, definitely check that out. So let's say you're pretty sure USERRA applies to you, but then something happens and you feel like your rights have been violated.
Oh, yeah.
What are your options then? What can you do?
Well, you've got two main paths. You can go through VETS or you can go straight to court.
Okay, so VETS first. What's that process like?
ETS is a great first step. You file a complaint with them, and they'll actually launch a full investigation.
So they don't just send a letter, they actually investigate.
They really dig into it, they gather evidence, they interview witnesses, the whole 9 yards. And if they can't reach a resolution with your employer on their own, they might even refer your case to the Department of Justice.
Wow, so it's serious business.
It is. It's about protecting your rights. And of course, you can also choose to file a private lawsuit in court if you feel that's the best route.
So you've got options, you're not powerless.
Exactly. You've got resources and legal avenues to pursue.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about VEVRAA, the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act.
Okay, so VEVRA. This one's all about federal contractors and subcontractors. It's got this two-pronged approach: prevention and action.
Prevention and action, I like that.
So on the prevention side, it's all about making sure these federal contractors aren't discriminating against protected veterans. But the action part is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, tell me more.
It's not just about saying, hey, don't discriminate. It's about actually pushing these companies to proactively recruit, hire, promote, and retain veterans. They're required to have written plans for how they're going to attract and advance veterans within their ranks.
So it's not just about avoiding bad behavior. It's about actively seeking out and supporting veterans.
Exactly. And it's not just lip service. They have to be accountable and show that they're making genuine efforts.
Now, when we talk about protected veterans, who exactly are we talking about? Who falls under that umbrella?
It's not a one-size-fits-all definition. VEVRA covers a few different categories of veterans, and knowing which one you fall under is crucial for ensuring you get the right protections.
So we won't go into all the categories here because it can get pretty technical. But what's the main takeaway for our listeners? Why is it important to know which category you're in?
The main point is that VEVRA recognizes that different groups of veterans face unique challenges, and it offers tailored protections based on those challenges. So whether you're dealing with a service-connected disability, you've recently separated from service, or you've earned specific medals or awards, VEVRA has got you covered.
So it's about understanding the nuances of your specific situation and how those nuances might impact your rights under VEVRA.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's say someone's listening. They're pretty sure they're a protected veteran.
Yeah.
But they think a company might be breaking the rules, maybe discriminating against them, or not fulfilling their VEVRA obligations. What's the next move?
Well, in that case, you'd want to reach out to the OFCCP, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs.
Okay, the OFCCP. And what do?
They're the ones who make sure that federal contractors are playing by the rules when it comes to worker rights, including VEVRA. So if you think a company isn't living up to its obligations, the OFCCP is your go-to.
So you file a complaint with them, and they'll investigate.
That's right. They'll look into the situation and make sure that the company is following the law.
Awesome. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah, there's so much more.
USERRA and VIVRE are huge, but I'm guessing there are a whole bunch of other laws that veterans should be aware of as well.
You are absolutely right. Think of USERRA and VIVRE as like the foundation, but there's a whole network of legal protections out there for you in the workplace. You're not alone, and you have rights.
All right, so before we move on to those other laws, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned so far. What are the key takeaways you want listeners to remember?
So first off, whether you're worried about discrimination or getting your old job back or finding a new job altogether, the law is on your side. USERRA and VIVRE provide some really strong protections, and understanding your eligibility is key. Second, those 5-year rules, they're not always cut and dry. If you serve longer, don't freak out. There might be exceptions that apply to you. And finally, remember those resources we talked about. VETs, the USERRA Advisor, the OFCCP. They are there to help you navigate all of this and make sure your rights are protected.
I love that. Knowledge is power, and it sounds like there's a lot of power out there for veterans.
Absolutely.
Fine.
Okay, so we've talked about USERRA, VIVRE. Those are like the big ones, right?
Yeah, the cornerstones, but I have a feeling there's a whole other layer of protection that we haven't even touched on yet.
You're absolutely right. And we're not just talking about some obscure laws that nobody's ever heard of. These are major federal laws that cover a wide range of workplace issues, and they're just as important for veterans as they are for anybody else.
So let's peel back that next layer. What's the first one we should talk about?
Well, you can't talk about employment rights without talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. This one is a game changer, especially for veterans who might have, sustained injuries or developed disabilities during their service.
Right, because serving in the military, it can be incredibly demanding, both physically and mentally, and it's not uncommon for people to come home with, some lasting effects. So how does the ADA protect veterans in those situations?
The ADA basically says that employers can't discriminate against you just because you have a disability. And it goes even further than that. They have to provide reasonable accommodations to help you do your job effectively.
So we're not just talking about like wheelchair ramps and accessible bathrooms here.
Right. It could be something as simple as modifying a workstation or offering flexible work hours or providing assistive technology. The key is that it has to be a reasonable accommodation that doesn't create an undue hardship for the employer.
And I'm guessing this covers both physical and mental disability.
Absolutely. And that's especially important for veterans who might be dealing with things like PTSD, anxiety, depression, any mental health condition that stems from their service.
So, for example, if a veteran needs a modified work schedule to attend therapy appointments, or maybe they need a quieter workspace to help manage their anxiety, the employer should be able to accommodate those needs.
Exactly. Mental health is just as important as physical health, and the ADA recognizes that. It's about creating a work environment where everybody can succeed, regardless of, their abilities or challenges.
Okay, so the ADA is all about ensuring equal opportunities for people with disabilities. What's next on our list?
Okay, next up we have Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Now, this one is a big one, and it covers a lot of ground. Basically, it prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, and religion.
So it's about making sure everyone has a fair shot, regardless of their background or their beliefs.
Precisely. And this applies to veterans just like anyone else. You can't be denied a job, a promotion, or training opportunities just because of your race or your religion or where you come from.
And I'm guessing sex discrimination, that now includes things like sexual orientation and gender identity?
You got it. The law has evolved to recognize that discrimination based on gender isn't just limited to men and women. It's about protecting everyone's right to be themselves in the workplace without fear of harassment or unfair treatment.
I love that. Okay, so we've got the ADA for disabilities, Title VII for those broader categories of discrimination. What else should veterans know about?
All right, well, don't forget about the Equal Pay Act. This one's pretty straightforward. It says men and women have to be paid equally for doing the same job.
Which seems like a no-brainer, but unfortunately, we know that the gender pay gap is still a very real issue. So this law helps to level the playing field a bit.
It does, and it applies to veterans just like any other worker. So if a female veteran discovers that she's making less than a male colleague for doing the exact same work, she has every right to file a complaint under the Equal Pay Act.
It's about recognizing that everyone's contributions are valuable, and your pay shouldn't be determined by your gender.
Exactly. Now, another law that's particularly relevant for veterans who might be transitioning to civilian careers a little later in life is the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. This one protects workers over 40 from being discriminated against because of their age.
So employers can't just assume that older workers are, less capable or less willing to learn new things.
Exactly. They can't refuse to hire you or pass you over for promotions or deny you training opportunities just because they think you're over the hill. Experience is valuable, and age should not be a barrier to success.
I love that. It's about recognizing that age is just a number, and it's your skills and experience that really matter.
Absolutely. Now, here's one that might not seem directly related to veterans, but it's important nonetheless. The Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA.
Okay, Gina, I'm not familiar with that one. What's that all about?
So GINA prevents employers from discriminating against you based on your genetic information. This includes your family medical history.
So, for example, if an employer finds out that your father had heart disease, they can't use that information to deny you a job or health insurance.
Exactly. It's about preventing discrimination based on things that are completely outside of your control. Your genetic makeup shouldn't be a barrier to employment or healthcare.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. ADA, Title VII, Equal Pay Act, Age Discrimination Act, GNA. It's like a whole arsenal of protection for workers, including veterans.
It is. And it's important to remember that these laws are always evolving. They're being interpreted in new ways all the time, so it's important to stay informed and know your rights.
Absolutely. But even with all these laws in place, sometimes things slip through the cracks. People make mistakes, biases creep in, and sometimes, unfortunately, blatant discrimination still happens.
Yeah.
So what can veterans do if they find themselves in the situation where they feel like their rights have been violated?
That's a great question, and it's something we're going to dig into a little bit more in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I want to emphasize one crucial thing. Documentation is your best friend.
Documentation. Like keeping a diary of everything that happens at work.
Not quite a diary, but you're on the right track. It's about keeping detailed records of anything that could be relevant if you ever need to file a complaint or talk to a lawyer.
Okay, so things like job applications, offer letters, performance reviews, emails, maybe even notes from meetings.
Exactly. And if something happens that makes you uncomfortable, jot down the details, the date, the time, who was involved, what was said. Were there any witnesses? Anything you can remember.
I can see how that would be helpful. It's like building a case file, just in case you ever need to take action.
It is. And trust me, you'll be glad you have that documentation if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to prove that something unfair or discriminatory happened.
Solid advice. So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what's the one key message you want listeners to walk away with?
I want them to know that they have a right to a fair and equitable workplace. And there are laws in place to protect them, but those laws are only effective if you know about them and you're willing to stand up for your rights.
Well said. Knowledge is power, and documentation is key. Now, let's move on to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore some practical tips for putting all this knowledge into action and making those laws work for you as you transition to a civilian career. Okay, so we've talked about the laws, we've talked about the resources, we've talked about documentation. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. How do you actually USE all this information to land a great civilian job and make sure your rights are protected along the way?
Yeah, because it's one thing to know your rights, but it's another thing entirely to actually apply them in the real world.
Exactly. So let's start with one of the biggest hurdles I think veterans face, and that's translating those hard-earned military skills into something that makes sense to a civilian hiring manager.
It's like speaking a different language
It
sometimes.
really is. It's like you've got all this amazing experience, but it's wrapped up in military jargon and acronyms that civilian employers just don't understand.
Right, and they might not even realize the value of your experience because they don't know how to translate it into civilian terms.
So what's the first step? How do you start to bridge that gap?
Well, you have to decode those skills. Think about the core competencies you've developed in the military: leadership, teamwork, problem solving, adaptability, discipline. These are universal skills that any employer would be thrilled to see.
So it's not about listing every single military operation you were involved in. It's about figuring out what those experiences taught you and how those lessons apply to a civilian job.
Exactly. Let's say you were in charge of logistics for a complex deployment. Well, that translates beautifully to project management, supply chain coordination, maybe even event planning. It's about connecting the dots and showcasing those transferable skills.
And don't forget those soft skills, things like communication, work ethic, integrity. Those are gold in any workplace. And I think it's safe to say that veterans tend to have those in spades.
Oh, absolutely. Those are the qualities that make you stand out from the crowd, the things that show you're not just skilled, but you're also reliable and dedicated. Don't be shy about highlighting those on your resume and in your interviews.
Now, let's talk about networking, because I know that can be a whole other challenge, especially if you're new to a particular industry or a new city.
Yeah, it's like trying to break into this exclusive club where everybody already knows each other.
It can be really intimidating.
Oh.
But the good news is that there are tons of organizations out there specifically designed to help veterans navigate that civilian networking scene.
Absolutely. Groups like Hire Heroes USA, Recruit Military, the American Legion, they understand the unique challenges that veterans face, and they have a wealth of resources to help. Resume workshops, interview coaching, job fairs, networking events, you name it.
It's like having a whole squad of career coaches in your corner, cheering you on and connecting you with the right people. So don't be afraid to reach out and tap into that support system. It's there for you.
It really is. And don't underestimate the power of connecting with other veterans who have already made the transition successfully. They've been there, they've done that, and they can offer some really valuable insights and advice.
All right, so you've got your resume polished, you're networking like a pro. Now it's time for the interview. And this is where things can get a little tricky when it comes to disclosing your military service. On one hand, you want to showcase those amazing skills and experiences, but on the other hand, you might be worried about potential bias or misconceptions that some employers might have about veterans.
It's definitely a balancing act. You're not obligated to disclose your service right away, but it's often a good idea to bring it up at some point, especially if it's relevant to the job you're applying for.
And when you do talk about your service, it's all about framing it in a way that resonates with civilian employers. Instead of getting bogged down in military jargon, focus on the transferable skills, the leadership qualities, the adaptability you've developed.
Right, be prepared to answer those questions about how your military experience directly relates to the specific role you're interviewing for.
Now, I hate to bring this up, but sometimes those interview questions can veer into uncomfortable territory, like asking about PTSD or making assumptions about veterans' mental health. What do you do if that happens?
Well, it's never okay for an employer to pry into your personal life or make assumptions about your mental health. So if you feel like a question is inappropriate or it crosses a line, don't be afraid to address it head on.
What would you say?
You could say something like, "That's a very personal question, and I'm not comfortable answering it. I'd be happy to talk about my qualifications and how my skills align with this role."
I love that. Yeah. It's a great way to redirect the conversation back to your strengths and avoid getting pulled into an uncomfortable discussion. You have the right to set boundaries and protect your privacy.
Absolutely. And if you encounter any outright discrimination or you feel like you're being treated unfairly because of your service, remember those resources we talked about? VETS, OFCCP, the EEOC. They are there to help you navigate those situations and make sure your rights are protected.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. You aced the interview, you landed the job, congratulations. But the journey doesn't end there, right? There are still things to be mindful of once you're in the workplace.
You're exactly right. It's important to understand your company's specific policies regarding things like military leave, deployment, any issues related to your service. Don't be afraid to ask questions and make sure you're clear on their procedures.
It's always better to be proactive and get that information up front than to run into surprises or misunderstandings down the line.
And remember, those federal laws we talked about earlier, USERRA, VEVERE, the AD, all of them, they still apply once you're on the job. So if you ever feel like your rights are being violated, don't hesitate to reach out to those organizations we discussed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main message you want our listeners to take away?
Well, I want them to know that they've served their country, they've developed incredible skills, and they have so much to offer the civilian workforce. Don't underestimate your value.
I love that.
Be proactive, be informed, be confident, and never be afraid to stand up for your rights.
So well said. Be proactive, be informed, be confident, and advocate for yourself. You got this. That wraps up our deep dive into employment rights for veterans and service members. We hope you found this information helpful, and we encourage you to check out the resources mentioned throughout this episode. Remember, knowledge is power, and now you have the power to navigate your civilian career with confidence.
Good luck out there.